Jessica Arnaya believed in love the way most people believe in sunlight, completely, without question, without ever imagining it could be taken from her. She was not a naive woman. She had grown up watching her father build a business from nothing, had sat beside him at boardroom tables before she was old enough to fully understand what was being discussed, had inherited not just his money when he passed, but his sharpness, his instinct, his quiet ability to read a room before anyone else in it had finished their first sentence. She was educated. She was perceptive. She was, by every reasonable measure, the kind of woman who did not fall for things easily. But she had fallen for Vincent Halim. And she had fallen completely. They met at a business conference 8 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, almost dangerously, the kind of man who made every person in the room feel as though they were the most important person in it. He had ambition. He had vision. He spoke about the future with such conviction that standing near him felt like standing near something about to become extraordinary. Jessica had been cautious at first, the way her father had taught her to be cautious. But Vincent was patient. He was persistent. And slowly, carefully, he dismantled every wall she had built around herself until there was nothing left between them but something that felt, at the time, completely and absolutely like love. They married 2 years later in a quiet ceremony, surrounded by people who genuinely believed they were watching two souls who belonged together. Jessica believed it most of all. The first year of their marriage was everything she had imagined. They built the company together, truly together, in the way that word is supposed to mean. Jessica brought the capital, her inheritance, carefully preserved and invested since her father's passing, became the financial backbone of what would eventually grow into one of the most respected mid-sized corporations in the city. Vincent brought the charisma, the public face, the handshake, and the smile that opened doors. Behind every door he opened, it was Jessica who had quietly arranged for it to be unlocked. She drafted the early business proposals. She sat with the lawyers, late into the night reviewing contracts while Vincent entertained clients at dinner. She was the one who noticed the details, the clause that needed revising, the partnership that looked promising on the surface but carried risk underneath, the financial projection that needed to be recalculated before anyone signed anything. She did all of this without complaint, without the need for acknowledgement, because she believed, sincerely and completely, that what she was building for both of them. For 6 years, she poured herself into that belief. She did not see what was growing beneath it. Looking back, there were signs. There are always signs. The late nights that Vincent stopped explaining. The business trips that stretched longer than they should have. The way he began holding his phone differently, angled away from her, screen dimmed, conversations taken in other rooms. The gradual cooling of something between them that Jessica had told herself was simply the natural settling of a long marriage, the way passion quiets into comfort and comfort into routine. She had told herself it was normal. She had not wanted to believe the alternative. The evening it ended did not announce itself. It arrived like any other Tuesday, the city already darkening outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment, dinner half prepared in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of a home that still looked, from the outside, entirely intact. Vincent came through the door at 7 in the evening. He was dressed well as he always was. His expression was composed, not cold exactly, but settled, the way a man looks when he has rehearsed something so many times in his head that performing it has become mechanical. He set his briefcase down. He did not kiss her hello. He walked to the dining table, reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and placed a manila envelope in front of her. Jessica looked at it. Then she looked at him. "What is this?" she asked. "Read it," he said simply. She opened it with hands that had not yet begun to tremble, because she still did not know, not fully, not yet, and found inside a set of legal documents bearing both their names. Divorce papers, prepared by a firm she had never heard of, dated 3 weeks earlier. The trembling started then. She looked up at him with a question she could not yet form into words, and what she found in his face was worse than anger, worse than guilt, it was nothing. A blankness. The expression of a man completing a transaction he had decided on long ago and was simply now finalizing. "Vincent, the accounts have already been separated," he said, cutting across whatever she had been about to say. "The assets have been transferred. The company shares are no longer in your name. My lawyers have ensured everything is in order." The words landed one by one like stones dropped into still water, each one sending a new wave of cold through her body. The accounts, the assets, the shares. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and opened her banking application. The balance that had always been there, the inheritance, the savings, years of careful financial management, read 0. She opened another account. 0. She tried to access the company's financial portal with her credentials and found that her access had already been revoked. Everything was gone. Not slowly, not partially, but completely, surgically, with a precision that told her this had not happened tonight. This had been happening for months, piece by piece, while she sat across from him at dinner and believed they were still building something together. She stood from the table on legs that barely held her. "You planned this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "All of it. You planned this while I was—" She stopped. She could not finish the sentence. The full shape of what he had done was still assembling itself in her mind, too large and too terrible to hold all at once. Vincent straightened his jacket. He picked up his briefcase. "My lawyers will be in contact," he said. "You have 30 days to vacate the apartment." He walked to the door. "Vincent!" He paused, one hand on the door handle, his back still to her. She waited for him to turn around. She waited for something, an explanation, a justification, the smallest acknowledgement of 6 years and everything she had given and everything she had trusted him with. He did not turn around. He opened the door and walked through it, and the sound of it closing behind him was the quietest, most devastating sound Jessica had ever heard in her life. She sat on the floor. She did not remember deciding to sit. Her legs simply gave way and the floor received her, and she stayed there for a long time in the apartment that had been a home an hour ago and was now only a building she would have to leave. She cried that night in a way she had not cried since her father died, from somewhere deep and wordless, the kind of grief that has no logic to it, only weight. She cried until her body had nothing left to give, until the apartment was silent and dark and the city outside the windows continued its indifferent glowing. At some point, she slept on the floor, and when morning came, gray and quiet and unremarkable, Jessica Arnaya opened her eyes. She lay still for a moment. The events of the previous night were not slow to return. They were immediate and complete, every detail precise and unsparing in her memory. She waited to feel the grief continue. It did not. What she felt instead was something quieter, something that moved differently than grief, not downward, not collapsing, but outward, expanding, a cold and crystalline thing taking shape in the space where devastation had been. She sat up slowly. She pushed her hair from her face. She looked around the empty apartment with eyes that were red but steady. Vincent had taken everything. He had taken the money, the assets, the company she had helped build from its very first breath. He had taken 6 years of her life and reduced them to a manila envelope and a 30-day notice. He believed she had nothing left. He believed that without the money, without the company, without him, she was nothing. Jessica rose to her feet. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below, busy and indifferent and full of people who had no idea what had just happened to her, and she felt something settle in her chest like iron cooling into its final shape. He forgot one thing, she thought. He forgot that I built that company too, and I remember everything I put inside it. She did not know yet exactly what she would do. She did not have a full plan, only the beginning of one, a single thread she intended to follow until it led her somewhere he never expected her to be. But it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. She left the apartment on the 29th day, not because she had to, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she stayed past the deadline Vincent's lawyers had given her. She left on the 29th day because she had spent every hour of those 29 days thinking, and by the time she walked out the door with a single suitcase and nothing else, she had already decided, quietly, completely, with the kind of certainty that does not require anyone else's confirmation, exactly who she was going to become. She did not tell anyone where she was going. She did not say goodbye. She simply disappeared, the way water disappears when it changes form, not gone, only transformed into something the eye can no longer easily track. For 12 months, Jessica Arnaya vanished from the world. No social media, no familiar faces, no trace of the woman who had once smiled beside Vincent Halim at charity galas and business dinners, always perfectly dressed, always gracious, always standing one careful step behind a man who had never deserved to be in front of her. Mutual friends, most of whom had always been Vincent's friends first, whispered among themselves that she had probably left the city in shame. A colleague who had once called herself close to Jessica mentioned at a dinner party that she'd heard Jessica had fallen apart completely. Someone else said they'd heard she'd moved back to her hometown. No one knew where she actually was. No one was looking hard enough to find out. And that, as it turned out, was exactly what she needed. She rented a small apartment in a part of the city where no one from her former life had reason to go. A quiet building on an unremarkable street, 3 floors up, with a window that looked out onto a row of old trees and nothing more dramatic than pigeons and passing clouds. It was the smallest space she had lived in since university. It was also, she realized within the first week, the first space that had ever felt entirely and unambiguously hers. No one else's name on the lease. No one else's preferences reflected in the furniture. No one else's schedule dictating when she slept and woke and ate and moved. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not miss the apartment she had left. She did not miss the expensive furniture, or the city views, or the life that had looked so impressive from the outside. What she had thought was home had been, she now understood, a stage, beautifully dressed, carefully lit, and completely hollow at its center. This small room, with its second-hand desk and its window full of trees, felt more real than any of it. She sat down at that desk on her first morning, and she began. Jessica had always been intelligent. She had known that about herself the way one knows the color of one's own eyes. A simple fact, unremarkable, just part of the given landscape of who she was. But intelligence, she had come to understand, is not the same as knowledge. And knowledge, without direction, is not the same as power. She had been intelligent for years. She had used that intelligence in service of a man who had quietly ensured she never used it fully for herself. That was over now. She enrolled in an online corporate law program under a different email address, paying with a prepaid card that could not be traced back to her name. She studied not casually, but with the focused, almost ferocious discipline of someone who understands that what they are learning is not academic, it is ammunition. She read contracts the way she had never read them before, not scanning for the general meaning but dissecting every clause, every subclause, every piece of careful language that lawyers use to hide things in plain sight. She was good at it. She realized with a cold kind of satisfaction, extraordinarily good at it. Within 3 months, she could read a legal document the way a surgeon reads a body, knowing not just what was on the surface, but exactly where the vulnerabilities were, exactly where to press, exactly where to cut. Corporate law was only the beginning. She taught herself financial systems next, not the surface-level understanding she had used as Vincent's quiet partner, but the architecture beneath it. How money moves through a corporation. How assets are classified, transferred, protected, and exposed. How digital financial infrastructure is built, and more importantly, how it can be dismantled by someone who knows precisely where the foundation is weakest. She found she had a particular talent for the digital side of things, for understanding the systems that most business people use without ever truly comprehending, the way most people use electricity without understanding the wiring behind the walls. She hired a private tutor, a young software architect who asked no questions and was paid well enough not to, and spent 2 months learning things that most corporate executives would never bother to understand because they had people for that. Jessica had decided she would no longer be a person who had people for things. Jessica was going to be the person who knew everything herself. The network came more slowly and more carefully. She was deliberate about who she allowed into her orbit during those 12 months. Not former colleagues. Too many of them were still connected to Vincent's world, and loyalty in business circles, she had learned, is fragile and frequently renegotiable. Not old friends. Most of them had already chosen their side, simply by choosing silence. Instead, she found people on the edges of the world she was rebuilding. A forensic accountant named Daniel who had spent 15 years untangling corporate fraud cases and had a particular distaste for men who hid assets behind their wives' names. A lawyer named Priya who specialized in financial litigation and who, when Jessica laid out the details of what had been done to her, had simply set down her coffee cup and said, "Tell me everything." A quiet, precise man named Marcus who moved in the same corporate circles as Vincent and owed Jessica a favor she had never collected until now. These were not friends exactly. They were something more useful than friends. They were people who were loyal not out of habit, not out of history, not out of affection that could be withdrawn, but out of alignment. They wanted the same thing she wanted. They believed in the same kind of justice she was beginning to build her entire life around. She trusted them the way she should have trusted people from the beginning, carefully, conditionally, and only after they had given her reason to. It was in the 8th month, during a late night at her desk surrounded by financial documents and cold coffee, that she remembered. It came to her not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow surfacing, a detail rising up through the accumulated weight of everything she had been studying, finally reaching the light because she now had the knowledge to recognize what it was. Years ago, before the company had grown into anything worth stealing, when it was still just an idea and a set of founding documents spread across their dining room table, it had been her hands that signed them. Vincent had been on the phone. He had been, as he frequently was in those early days, performing the role of visionary while Jessica quietly handled the actual paperwork. She had read every page, and on one of those pages, written into a clause so embedded in legal language that it would take someone specifically looking for it to find it, she had made an addition. Small, precise, perfectly legal. The kind of clause that a distracted lawyer reviewing hundreds of documents might nod past without registering its full implication. A master access provision. One digital key. One password of her own creation. One mechanism that, under specific conditions that she had carefully defined, gave its holder complete, legally binding, and unilateral control over the entire financial architecture of the company. Every account, every asset, every share, everything. She had done it without fully knowing why at the time. An instinct, a quiet, unbothered act of self-preservation from a woman who had not yet consciously admitted to herself that she might one day need it. She sat very still at her desk as the full shape of what this meant assembled itself in her mind. Vincent had taken everything from her. He had taken the money and the property, and the shares and the name, and the 6 years she would never get back. He had done it with confidence, the deep, unshakable confidence of a man who had never for a single moment considered that his quiet, trusting wife might have thought further ahead than he had. He had built his empire on a foundation that still, legally and absolutely, had her name at its root. And she had the key. Jessica set down her coffee cup. She opened a new document on her laptop and began to write, not with the trembling hands of the woman who had sat on a cold floor 11 months ago, but with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who has just realized that the game they thought they had lost was never actually over. It had simply been waiting for her to be ready to finish it. Vincent had never believed his wife was capable of thinking that far ahead. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. In the 12th month, Jessica Arnaya closed the last of her notebooks, looked at what she had built, and made one final decision. Jessica Arnaya would not be the one to walk back into Vincent's world. Someone else would. Someone he had never met. Someone he would never see coming. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was not a single dramatic moment, no sudden revelation in front of a mirror, no cinematic scene of cutting her hair and emerging from a bathroom a different woman. It was instead a gradual and deliberate process, methodical in the way that everything Jessica did during those 12 months had been methodical. She approached it the way she had approached the law, the financial systems, the network she had built, with patience, with precision, and with the quiet understanding that anything worth doing is worth doing completely. She started with the surface, because the surface was what the world would see first. She changed the way she dressed, not dramatically enough to look like someone in costume, but fundamentally enough to alter the impression she made upon entering a room. Gone were the soft silhouettes and muted colors she had favored during her years as Vincent's wife, the wardrobe of a woman who had unconsciously learned to take up less visual space. In their place, clean, architectural lines, dark, authoritative palettes, clothes that did not ask permission to be noticed. She changed the way she moved. She had always been quietly confident, but quiet confidence, she had learned, is easily overlooked. She practiced the kind of stillness that powerful people carry, the ability to occupy a space without filling it with unnecessary movement or sound, to let silence work in your favor rather than rushing to fill it, to make people come to you rather than moving toward them. She changed her hair, a small thing perhaps, but not an insignificant one. Where she had once worn it softly, she now wore it simply and severely, pulled back with a precision that left no question about the face it framed. And then she changed her name. Jessica Rain. She chose it carefully, the way she chose everything now. Not a name that screamed for attention. She had no interest in spectacle. A name that was clean and direct and carried, if one listened to it with the right ear, the faintest suggestion of something earned rather than inherited. Something claimed. She registered it legally through channels that were perfectly above board and left no obvious thread connecting it to Jessica Arnaya. She established a consulting firm under that name, Rain Corporate Advisory, with a sleek, minimal online presence that revealed just enough to be credible and just little enough to remain intriguing. A list of services, a set of testimonials from clients who were real people, people in her new network who had agreed to vouch for work she had genuinely done for them during her 12 months of preparation. A professional photograph in which she looked exactly like what she was presenting herself as, formidably competent and entirely unknowable. She had no office. She did not need one yet. The work she was preparing to do required no physical address. It required only reputation, and reputation, she had discovered, could be built with surprising speed by the right people saying the right things in the right rooms. She set Daniel, Marcus, and Priya to work on that. Quietly, without fanfare, dropping her name into conversations where it would do the most good. A mention here at a private equity dinner. A reference there in a legal consultation. A name passed along as a recommendation in a boardroom where several of Vincent's current business partners happened to be sitting. Within 8 weeks of Rain Corporate Advisory's quiet establishment, the name Jessica Rain had begun to circulate. She watched Vincent from a careful distance during this time. Not obsessively. She had no interest in obsession, had deliberately trained herself out of anything that looked like it might compromise her clarity. But strategically, clinically, the way a navigator watches weather patterns before choosing a route. What she saw confirmed what she had suspected from her research. Vincent's company, for all its polished exterior, was beginning to show fractures. 2 major contracts had fallen through in the past 6 months. Not publicly, not in any way that had yet reached the press, but visibly enough to people who knew how to read the signs. His cash flow had tightened. A property development partnership he had staked considerable capital on had stalled indefinitely. The woman he had left Jessica for, a fact she had confirmed early and then deliberately set aside, because it was irrelevant to what she was building, had expensive tastes and no apparent interest in the boring reality of a business under pressure. Vincent was stretched. He was performing confidence he no longer entirely felt. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man who receives an extraordinary offer and grabs for it before asking the questions he should ask. She chose Marcus to make the approach. Marcus was ideal for the purpose. Polished, unhurried, with the particular kind of credibility that comes from having spent years in the same professional circles as the person being approached. Vincent would recognize his face. Vincent would trust, or at least not distrust, a man whose name appeared in the same industry directories and whose handshake he had exchanged at 2 or 3 events over the past decade. More importantly, Marcus was someone who understood discretion at a molecular level. He would say exactly what Jessica scripted. He would answer exactly the questions she had prepared him for. And he would give away nothing, not a word, not a glance, not a single unscripted detail that might cause Vincent Halim to pause and think more carefully than Jessica wanted him to. She spent 3 evenings preparing Marcus. They sat across from each other at her desk, and she walked him through every scenario, every question Vincent might ask, every objection he might raise, every direction the conversation might take, until Marcus could navigate it without hesitation. And if he asks about Jessica Rain directly, Marcus asked during their final session. Her background, her history. Jessica had considered this carefully. "Tell him she is private," she said. "Tell him she prefers her work to speak for itself. If he pushes, tell him that the most accomplished people rarely need to explain themselves to anyone." Marcus had smiled slightly at that. "He'll find that attractive," he said. "Men like Vincent always do. They mistake mystery for weakness." "I know," Jessica said simply. "That's why I chose it." The meeting between Marcus and Vincent took place on a Wednesday afternoon at a restaurant Vincent frequented. Neutral ground, or so Vincent believed. Marcus arrived first and was seated when Vincent came through the door, which meant Vincent had to walk toward him rather than the other way around. A small thing, deliberate. The proposal Marcus laid on the table was a masterpiece of Jessica's construction. A strategic partnership between Rain Corporate Advisory and Vincent's company, structured as a project-based collaboration on a large-scale commercial development that Jessica had designed to look, from every visible angle, like the most lucrative opportunity Vincent had seen in 3 years. The numbers were real. The partner companies listed were real, members of Jessica's network who had agreed, for their own various reasons, to participate in the scaffolding of this architecture. The projected returns were calculated with precision, designed to be impressive without being so extraordinary that a cautious man might question them. Vincent was not a cautious man. He never had been. Caution had never been necessary when there was always someone quieter and more careful standing slightly behind him, doing the work he didn't bother to do. That person was no longer there. He leaned forward within the first 10 minutes. By the halfway point of the meeting, Marcus could see the hunger in his eyes, that particular brightness that Vincent had always carried when he believed something valuable was within reach. By the time the check arrived, Vincent had already begun mentally spending the returns. He asked about Jessica Rain once, briefly. Marcus gave him exactly what Jessica had prepared. "She's private, prefers her results to introduce her. The people who've worked with her don't tend to need further explanation." Vincent nodded, satisfied. He was not a man who spent much time thinking carefully about the people behind the opportunities presented to him. He never had been. 3 days later, the contract was delivered to Vincent's office for review. It was 47 pages long. Vincent signed it after reading 11. He celebrated that evening at the same restaurant where the meeting had taken place, this time with a table of associates. Champagne ordered without looking at the price, the loud and performative confidence of a man who needed witnesses to his own success. He toasted to new beginnings. He toasted to opportunity. He toasted, with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes, to the future. No one at the table knew that the contract he had signed contained, embedded within its 47 pages, a set of provisions that quietly and legally activated the dormant mechanisms Jessica had planted in the company's founding documents years ago. No one at the table knew that the partnership he was celebrating was not a partnership at all. It was a door, held open just long enough for him to walk through it, after which it would close permanently behind him. No one at the table knew that the woman who had designed every detail of this evening, the meeting, the proposal, the contract, the timing, all of it, was sitting in a quiet room across the city at that very moment, looking at the signed document that Marcus had just delivered to her. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked at his signature on the final page, the same confident, oversized signature she had watched him make 1,000 times, and she nodded once, the way a chess player nods when the final piece has been moved into place. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph, with the absolute, unshakable calm of someone who prepared for this moment for an entire year and is now simply watching the sequence of events she set in motion arrive, one by one, exactly as she designed them. The game was no longer beginning. It was already over. Vincent Halim raised his champagne glass and felt like a king. He did not know that the kingdom he was celebrating already had a different owner. He had signed her name back into everything. He just didn't know it yet. 3 days passed between the signing of the contract and the night Jessica chose to act. She did not rush. Rushing was for people who were afraid. Afraid that the window would close, that the opportunity would pass, that the other person might figure it out before they were ready. Jessica was not afraid of any of those things. She had designed this with sufficient precision that there was no window to miss, no opportunity that could slip away, no angle she had left unguarded. She had spent 12 months building something that could not be undone by impatience, and she was not going to compromise it now by acting before the moment was exactly right. She used those 3 days to verify. She went through every document one final time, not because she doubted her own work, but because she was the kind of person who checks the parachute twice before stepping out of the plane, not out of fear but out of discipline. She confirmed with Priya that every legal mechanism was correctly positioned and would withstand scrutiny. She confirmed with Daniel that the financial architecture would execute cleanly, without error, without any thread that could be successfully challenged in court. She confirmed with Marcus that Vincent had not, in the days since signing, shown any sign of unease. Any indication that something had caught his attention, prompted a closer reading of the contract, made him call a lawyer he trusted more than the ones he had used. Marcus reported back on the second day. "He's been telling people about the partnership," Marcus said. "Told 3 separate business contacts it's going to turn things around for him. He's already planning how he'll spend the returns." Jessica absorbed this without visible reaction. "Good," she said. "Then we proceed on Thursday." She chose Thursday because it was a day with no particular significance, not the anniversary of anything, not a date that could later be interpreted as symbolic or personal. She had no interest in symbolism. What she was doing was not an act of theater. It was an act of correction, precise and deliberate, and it deserved a date as clean and unremarkable as the logic behind it. Thursday, midnight, 1 password. That was all it would take. The hours before midnight she spent in ordinary ways. She ate a proper meal, something she had made herself, simple and unhurried, at the small table by her window. She read for an hour, a book entirely unrelated to law or finance or anything that had occupied her mind for the past year, a novel she had been meaning to finish for months. She took a long shower. She made tea. People who observed her from the outside, had there been anyone to observe, would have seen a woman spending a quiet evening at home. Nothing in her manner suggested that she was hours away from dismantling an empire. That was, she had come to understand, the truest measure of how much she had changed. The Jessica, who had sat on the floor of that apartment a year ago, could not have eaten a quiet meal on a night like this. She would have been shaking. She would have been second-guessing. She would have been somewhere between grief and rage, too full of feeling to be still. This Jessica was still. Not because she felt nothing. She was not yet sure, in those quiet hours, exactly what she felt, but because she had learned, through 12 months of deliberate and sometimes painful practice, to place her emotions somewhere they could not interfere with what her hands needed to do. She would examine what she felt when it was over. Tonight, she simply needed to be precise. She sat down at her desk at 11:45. She set her tea to the right of her laptop. She adjusted the angle of her screen. She opened the folder, the one she had kept locked behind 3 separate layers of encryption for over a year, the one that contained the key and everything surrounding it, all the legal documentation that would make what she was about to do not just devastating but completely, immovably legitimate. She checked the time. 11:58. She waited. At midnight, the city was still. Jessica sat alone in front of her laptop screen. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her face held no trace of excitement, no flicker of vengeance, no visible emotion of any kind. She opened the folder. She typed the password, 23 characters, a string she had memorized so completely that her fingers found it without conscious direction, the way a pianist's hands find notes they have practiced 10,000 times. She looked at the screen for one moment, not hesitating, not reconsidering, simply looking, the way one looks at something before it changes permanently, not out of sentiment, but out of the clean human instinct to mark the moment before a before becomes an after. Then she pressed enter. What happened next was not loud. There was no dramatic sound, no alarm, no crash, nothing that announced itself to the sleeping city outside her window. The mechanism she had built operated in complete silence, the way the most precise things always do. Code executing, systems responding, a sequence of automated instructions moving through digital infrastructure like water finding its level, inevitable, unstoppable, and entirely indifferent to the devastation it was causing. But Jessica watched it happen in real time on her screen. The first alert came within 40 seconds, a notification from the system confirming that the master access provision had been recognized and accepted. Legal, binding, unambiguous. Then the cascade began. The company's primary financial accounts, the operational funds, the reserve capital, the investment holdings that Vincent had built up over years, using money that had originally come from her, froze simultaneously. Not drained, not stolen, frozen, pending the legal transfer process that Priya had architected with the kind of meticulous care that would make it impossible for any court to successfully challenge. Every rupiah accounted for, every movement documented, every step in the chain of custody clean and traceable and correct. The asset transfer notifications followed. Properties, holdings, intellectual property that Vincent had moved into the company's name during the months before he filed for divorce, thinking he had been clever, thinking he had covered every angle. He had not covered this one. He had not even known this one existed. Partner contracts began dissolving at 12:17. The clauses embedded within them, quietly, legally, with language that any competent lawyer would have caught had they been reading carefully enough, activated in sequence, each one triggering the next, a row of dominoes that Jessica had spent months setting up with absolute care. Companies that had been in formal partnership with Vincent's firm received automatic legal notifications that the foundational agreements underpinning their contracts had been materially altered by provisions now in effect. Their own legal teams, woken in the middle of the night by alerts from monitoring systems, would spend the next several hours confirming what their screens were telling them. By 1 a.m, 3 of Vincent's largest partners had already initiated emergency calls with their legal departments. By 2, the first formal withdrawal notice had been filed. By 3, the story had reached the kind of quiet financial networks that move faster than any news outlet. The private channels, the encrypted group conversations between executives and investors, and people whose entire professional lives depend on knowing what is happening before it becomes public. By 4 a.m, Vincent Halim's name was moving through those channels like a warning. Jessica monitored all of it from her desk. She did not sleep, not because she was agitated. She was not, but because she had decided she wanted to witness what she had built doing what she had built it to do. She sat with her tea going cold beside her, and her eyes moving steadily across the screen she had arranged in front of her, each one showing a different feed, a different system, a different confirmation that the sequence was proceeding exactly as designed. At 4:37, Daniel sent her a single message. Clean. Every line. Nothing contestable. She read it once, set the phone down. At 5:12, Priya sent a document, the first of the legal filings that would become public record when the courts opened that morning. Jessica opened it, reviewed it, found it exactly as they had discussed. She closed the document. She looked out her window. The city was beginning to lighten at its edges, that particular gray that arrives before dawn proper, when the darkness has not yet fully released its hold but the night is clearly losing. Somewhere across that city, in an apartment that had been paid for with stolen money and decorated with a confidence that was about to become very difficult to maintain, Vincent Halim was asleep. He did not yet know. He was still, at this moment, sleeping with the particular ease of a man who believes himself to be on the verge of something good. Jessica watched the sky lighten and felt something move through her that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, something quieter than either, something that had no clean name, the feeling of a long and necessary thing finally reaching its conclusion. By the time the sun rose fully over the city, it was done. Every account frozen, every asset reclassified, every partnership dissolved, every thread that connected Vincent Halim to the empire he had built on her money and her work and her silence had been legally, permanently, and irrevocably severed. Vincent Halim had nothing. Not a company, not a reputation that would survive what was now in motion. Not a single asset to his name that had not already been flagged, frozen, or formally reclaimed. The man who had walked out on his wife without looking back had become, in a single night, exactly what he had tried to make her. Nothing. Jessica finally stood from her desk at 6:45 in the morning. She stretched. She carried her cold cup of tea to the kitchen and poured it out and made a fresh one. She stood at her window and held the warm cup in both hands and looked out at the ordinary morning, the trees, the pigeons, the first people of the day moving along the street below with their coffee and their ordinary concerns and their lives entirely unaffected by what had just happened in the city's financial undercurrents. She thought about the girl who had signed those founding documents years ago, the woman who had sat on a cold floor and believed that the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing everything. She had learned, in the years since, that losing everything is not the worst thing. The worst thing is losing everything and not getting back up. She had gotten back up. She took a sip of her tea. Somewhere across the city, a phone was about to start ringing in an apartment where a man was still asleep, and the morning that was about to arrive for him would be the last ordinary morning of his life. Jessica set down her cup. She had one more thing left to do. The empire had fallen in a single night. Now it was time for Vincent Halim to finally look at the face of the woman who had taken it. He called her office line at 7 in the morning. Not Marcus. Not Priya. Not Daniel. Vincent called the number listed on the Rain Corporate Advisory website directly, the number that Jessica had set up knowing, with complete certainty, that this call would eventually come. She had simply not known exactly when. She had prepared for the possibility that it might take a week. She had prepared for the possibility that Vincent, in the first shock of what had happened, might try legal channels first, might attempt to fight rather than surrender, might hire lawyers and issue counterfilings before he truly understood the completeness of what had been done. She had underestimated how quickly a man collapses when there is genuinely nothing left to hold on to. 7 in the morning. 3 days after the night, everything fell. Her assistant, a composed young woman named Sari who knew only that she worked for a corporate consulting firm and that certain calls were to be handled in certain ways, answered, took the name, and sent Jessica a message with 3 words. Vincent Halim. Calling. Jessica was at her desk when the message arrived. She was dressed. She had been awake for 2 hours already, had eaten breakfast, had reviewed the morning's legal updates from Priya with the same calm attention she brought to everything. She read Sari's message once. She typed back 2 words. Put him through. His voice on the phone was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for anger, the particular aggressive anger of a cornered man who has not yet accepted that he is cornered. She had prepared for denial, for accusation, for the kind of furious bluster that men like Vincent default to when reality becomes inconvenient. She had scripts for all of it, responses prepared with the cool efficiency of someone who has thought 3 moves ahead of every possible direction. What she heard instead was a voice that had already been broken open. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He said her name, her new name, Jessica Rain, still not knowing, and his voice cracked on the second syllable in a way that told her everything she needed to know about where he was. I need to meet with you, he said. In person. Please. The last word landed differently than she had anticipated. Please. She had heard Vincent Halim say many things over the years, confident things, charming things, things that turned out to be carefully constructed lies, but she had never once heard him say please and mean it the way he meant it now. She said nothing for a moment, not because she was moved, but because she was noting it, filing it away with the same clinical precision she brought to everything, the observation that a man who had never needed to beg for anything in his life was now begging, and that the sound of it was not satisfying in the way she might once have imagined it would be. It was simply information. Thursday, she said. 2 o'clock. I'll send you the address. She ended the call before he could respond. She chose a meeting room in a building she used occasionally for client work, neutral, professional, a space that belonged to neither of them and carried no history. A glass table. For chairs. A window overlooking a courtyard where nothing of significance had ever happened. She arrived 20 minutes early. She arranged the room the way she wanted it. Her chair positioned with its back to the window, so that the light fell on his face rather than hers, the folder placed precisely in the center of the table where it would be visible from the moment he entered. She poured 2 glasses of water and did not touch hers. She sat down, straightened her jacket, and folded her hands on the table. She was completely still when the door opened. Vincent came to find her 3 days later. He was unrecognizable. She had known, intellectually, that he would look different. She had known that 3 days inside the collapse of everything he had built and stolen and called his own would leave marks on a person. She had factored this in. She had believed she was prepared for it. She was not entirely prepared for this. The man who walked through the door was wearing the ghost of Vincent Halim like an ill-fitting suit. The posture that had always been his most reliable armor, straight-backed, shoulders set, the physical language of a man who has never doubted his right to occupy space was gone. He moved as though the air had become heavier than he could comfortably carry. His face, always so carefully composed in public, had not been composed in days. The shadows beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept. His hands, she noticed as he pulled out the chair across from her, were trembling slightly, a fine, barely visible tremor that she suspected he was trying very hard to suppress. He sat down. He looked at her, and she watched the precise moment it happened. The moment his eyes, moving across her face with the desperate searching look of a drowning man looking for something to hold, snagged on something they recognized. A quality of stillness, a particular set of the jaw, something in the way she occupied the room that was not quite like anyone else he had ever met, because there was only one other person he had ever met who carried herself in precisely that way. She watched him begin to understand. She said nothing. She let him arrive at it himself, because that too was part of what he needed to carry, not to be told, but to see, to have the realization assemble itself inside him piece by piece until it was complete and undeniable. His face changed in slow motion, the confusion first, then the searching quality intensifying, then something that flickered across his expression like a light being switched on in a dark room, sudden and total and illuminating nothing comfortable. Jessica, he said. Not a question. Not her new name. Her real name. The name he had left behind in an empty apartment more than a year ago along with everything else he had decided was no longer useful to him. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. His chair scraped back slightly as the full weight of it reached him, not just who she was, but what that meant. What it meant that the woman sitting across from him in this immaculate jacket with this immaculate composure was the same woman he had handed divorce papers to without meeting her eyes. What it meant that every piece of this, the approach, the partnership, the contract, the key, all of it, had been her. Had always been her. He fell to his knees, not metaphorically. His legs simply gave way, and he was on the floor beside the glass table with his hands pressed together and his face breaking apart in real time, and Jessica watched it happen from her chair without moving a single muscle. He begged. He begged with the total, shameless desperation of a man who has nothing left to protect. Not dignity, not pride, not the carefully maintained image he had spent years constructing. He begged her to stop the legal proceedings. He begged her to speak to the investigators, to tell them something that might redirect the trajectory of what was already in motion. He begged her to protect what remained of his name in the business community, though both of them knew there was very little left to protect. And then he wept. Real tears, she noted. Not the performative emotion of a man trying to manipulate, but the ugly, graceless tears of someone who has genuinely arrived at the end of something and has no performance left in him. They ran down his face unchecked, and he did not try to wipe them away, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she registered that this was the most honest she had ever seen him. It had taken destroying him completely to get here. And then, in the most revealing moment of his character, the moment that told her everything she had ever needed to know about who Vincent Halim truly was at his center, he said the word. "I still love you, Jessica. Whatever you believe about me, I need you to know that." She looked at him. The word hung in the air between them the way certain words do, heavy with their own history, weighted by every context in which they had been used before. She heard it land. She waited for something inside her to respond to it. Some residual warmth, some ember of the feeling that had once made her believe in this man completely, some flicker of the Jessica who had stood beside him at an altar and meant every word she said. There was nothing. Not anger, not contempt, not grief, not the cold satisfaction of watching him use the word that had once been his primary weapon now reduced to a plea. Only stillness, only the vast, unbroken quiet of a place inside her that had once been full and was now simply empty. She understood, sitting in that stillness, that this was not something he had done to her in the single night he walked out the door. This was something that had happened slowly over the year that followed. She had not chosen numbness. She had not cultivated it deliberately. It had simply arrived the way scar tissue arrives, not as punishment, not as failure, but as the body's most honest response to a wound that had gone deep enough. She was not broken. She was not cold. She was not cruel. She was finished. And finished, she was discovering, felt nothing like what she had imagined. She reached for the folder on the table. She placed it gently in front of him, the physical weight of it making a small, final sound as it met the glass. "That is a copy of everything going to the prosecutor's office tomorrow morning," she said. Her voice was even, quiet, completely without the anger or satisfaction that would have told him he still mattered enough to produce either. "You may read it tonight if you wish." She stood. She straightened her jacket with 2 precise movements. Vincent's hand shot out and closed around the edge of the table, not grabbing her, just reaching, the instinctive reaching of someone who feels something slipping away and cannot stop themselves from trying. His voice came apart completely when he spoke. "Jessica, please. Don't do this. Please." She picked up her bag. Jessica, her old name, the name she had carried through 6 years of loving him and 1 year of becoming someone he could never have anticipated. He said it like an invocation, like he believed that if he used it correctly, something of the woman who had answered to it might still be present somewhere in the room and might hear him and might stop. She walked toward the door. Her heels were quiet on the floor. Her posture was straight. Her breathing was even. She did not hesitate. She did not slow. She did not look back. Because the woman who had once loved Vincent Halim enough to build him an empire with her bare hands, who had cried his name into empty rooms and believed in him past every reasonable point of belief, had made her exit long ago. What walked out of that room was Jessica Rain, a woman with clear eyes and steady hands and a year of deliberate, painful, necessary transformation behind her. A woman who had learned that the most powerful thing a person can become is precisely and completely themselves, not the version shaped by someone else's needs, not the version diminished by someone else's cruelty, but the version that emerges when everything false has finally been burned away. The door closed behind her, quietly, without drama, the way the most final things always do. She did not look back, not because she was heartless, but because everything worth carrying she had already taken with her, and everything she had left behind was exactly where it deserved to be.